So I ended up going to the Wixoss ceremony in June. This is the North American tournament that ended up with over 150 players. Now, I'm not sure exactly which place I ended up with. I haven't checked the standings that closely. My final record was 3-4 running Sanbaka, and given Sanbaka as a deck, I think that's a pretty respectable finish. There's a few matches I wish I had played a little bit better in that I think I could have won, but overall, especially given that Sanbaka is not the most meta deck out there, I'm reasonably satisfied with that placement. So, rather than going over that exactly, anyone who's out there and still crazy enough to continue playing Sanbaka, I just wanted to go over a quick update to the list I published a few months back. So the deck I brought to the tournament made a few changes from that list. We'll start with the Lyrig deck. I am no longer running Sanba Carnival. Instead, I've decided to try out End of the Turn. Sanba Carnival is very expensive, and this deck has enormous problems generating enough Ener. In some decks, Sanba Carnival might be a reasonable choice, but this deck simply can't generate the Ener needed to make sure that it's a usable piece. So I wanted something a little bit more versatile and a little bit more accessible in that piece slot, and I ended up going up with End of the Turn. End of the Turn has two big advantages. The first is that it can be used defensively to stop an opposing removal spell. The Lyrig deck of Sanbaka is already a little bit light on defenses, and this just gives you a little bit more gas to defend yourself against early aggressive starts. It also can bring back a Signy from the trash, and Sanbaka is very good at filling up your trash over the course of the game, giving you a huge amount of selection to pull out potential 1 and 2 inclusions in the deck. We'll get into that a little bit later. These two effects are both very useful, and they're both quite useful in different games, and overall I like the versatility and the, obviously, zero cost that this card adds to the deck. The centers are obviously exactly the same, not a whole lot to say there. They're generally very solid, and I think that Toko is actually a very good center Lyrig. Lisa is also quite strong. Again, there's not really a whole lot of variety that you have to choose from here, but the two Lyrigs that you are going to be including in most Sanbaka lists are very solid. For level 1, it gives you a huge amount of leeway in mulligans, which I'll get into a little bit later when I talk about how the deck actually plays out. And her level 2 is basically a copy of Akino Bye Bye, which is a very solid assist. Over in the Ange slot, however, I've changed both of these from the list I printed earlier. I tried out the level 1 that trashes instead of vanishes. I figured the 1 Ener cost, especially early in the game, wasn't going to be too much of a demerit, and being able to trash the Signy as opposed to simply bouncing it to hand seemed like a positive effect, especially given that this deck tended to try and Ener starve the opponent, especially in lists with Sanba Carnival, which we're not having. I'll get into that a little bit more when I talk about the changes I'd make in the future. For the level 2, I've actually switched over to Anja Mark 1. Again, still not entirely sure how you're supposed to pronounce those quotation marks, but overall, this has been a positive change. I think any of the Anja assists are all somewhat equal. It just kind of depends on what you want to hedge against in this particular slot. This one is very good at stopping aggressive strategies like No Limit. It fills in 2 lanes for 2 Ener, or it can fill in 1 lane for absolutely 0 Ener. It's very versatile, and it's very cheap. Now, putting cards from your hand into play can be a bit tricky, but Sanbaka tends to generate enough cards in hand that this isn't a particularly real cost. So this is just an efficient way of closing out 1 or 2 lanes in order to save you a bit of damage. The other options are the starter deck Enge, and that's the one that trashes 1, bounces 1, and it's very efficient against control decks. Against aggro decks, I've found it to be nearly useless. It's basically a dead slot in the deck. You're not getting a whole lot of utility out of it. Against control matchups, though, it's incredibly devastating, such as against Nova. It makes your matchup in that very positive. Generally, I've found that this deck already has a pretty positive matchups against other slower decks, so I wanted to add in a slot that would give me a little bit more legs against matchups like No Limit, which are kind of a nightmare matchup for this deck. Coming back into the main deck, you'll see a lot of inclusions that are pretty familiar and a few that have changed up a bit. Tamaki Fumino is a very, very solid level 2 option. She has a great life burst, and being able to field 10,000 power Signy on level 2 is a really solid way of defending yourself from early aggressive strategies. I finally picked up my second copy of Lulu, so she has replaced Nuit Sorcière. She is, I think, in most cases just a strict upgrade. Likewise, I've got my 4 copies of Himawari. She is very solid. She provides a strong defensive wall against aggro, and she's able to dig deeper into your deck to keep your cards flowing into hand against control matchups. Now, the last couple slots are where things get a little bit spicier than that first list. Arish Kigal and Polaris are both extremely situational Signy. They're going to be great in some games and in some matchups, and nearly useless against others. However, because the deck is so good at putting cards into your trash, and both of your pieces are able to return any Signy from your trash to your hand, not just virtuals, these give you just 2 quick and easy utility pieces to pull out of your trash to use as kind of a toolbox against different matchups. Polaris, for example, is terrific against slower opponents, forcing an early refresh, and often they're not going to be expecting that at all, especially out of a deck like this. Arish Kigal is likely, similarly, very strong against control matchups, letting you trade in 2 of your life cloth to trash your opponent's entire board. Generally speaking, that's not going to be a great effect, but in situations where it is good, it is going to be backbreaking. Once again, this card is often fine just sitting in your trash not doing anything, but it's really nice to have access to this effect in the games where it is going to make a difference. Finally, there are 3 spells included here. Reticle Digger and 2 Enervating Melodies. These all more or less fulfill the same function. They remove an opposing Signy early in the game. Reticle Digger is obviously a much better card because of the Exceed option. Enervating Melody is included more just to fill out life burst quotas. That is one problem that this deck does have, and that is that it has a ton of cards that it wants to play that do not have life bursts. But finding cards with life burst you actually do want to put in your deck can be a little bit challenging. One example is Meiji Wara Beta, which I'm not particularly fond of, but I'm simply playing her because I need cards with life burst, and she's a functional virtual Signy that happens to have life burst. Both of these cards are included for the exact same reason, and that's to push early offense. Without the starter deck Anja, this deck lacks ways to clear lanes early in the game, and using your Anja level 1 is a good way to open lanes. However, if you use it too early in the game, it can leave you a little bit short on offensive options later on. So having a spell to clear out an open lane at level 1 is extremely useful. This helps cover off one of the weaker points in the deck in that it's a little bit slow to hit the ground running. Often, most of your removal is only going to be particularly effective once you hit level 3, but the deck doesn't have the defenses to reliably survive in a game where you only start pushing damage at level 3. So this lets you push a little bit more damage a little bit earlier, and Reticle Digger is actually a pretty fantastic option because of that Exceed. Even if you draw it later, it's going to be extremely potent at removing an opposing Signy. Generally speaking, these cards did their job extremely well, and I think 3 is the correct number here. You don't want to get a whole lot more than that because, again, you do need a certain threshold of virtual Signy to make sure that everything is running smoothly, particularly Melissa Karenka, who is an extremely good card if you can get those 5 virtual Signy in your trash and turn her into a 7,000 power. She's only a 2,000 power card that puts 3 cards in your trash. She's still passable, but she's not particularly great. So that's the deck, and immediately after the tournament, I decided to make a few quick changes. First up, I swapped out the Anja level 1 Mark 1 back into the Return to Hand Anja. 1 enter is not a whole lot one way or the other, especially with Sanbaka Carnival out of the deck. However, it does still make a difference, and in subsequent games, there's at least 1 game that I lost by not having 1 spare enter at the end of that game. Overall, the deck doesn't really have enough other resource denial to really maximize trashing the opponent's Signy as opposed to just returning it to hand. So returning to hand is more or less going to have a similar effect on the course of the game, and you save an enter. So I've gone back to that starter deck level 1 Anja. Likewise, I have cut one of the Meiji Wara Betas to go back up to 4 Tamaki Fuminos. Again, having 10,000 power is extremely important against early aggro decks, and I might as well touch on what this deck wants to be doing as its main game plan. Turn 1, you are able to mulligan very aggressively. Generally speaking, there's only 3 cards you are interested in seeing in your starting hand, and everything else should be mulliganed. Lisa level 1 is able to dig you out of any kind of hole you mulligan yourself into pretty effectively because she's able to dig so deep and find any level 1 Signy in the deck that's not Servant Sharp. Because you're able to dig so effectively, you really want to make sure that your level 1 is going to be as optimal as possible. So with that in mind, what you want to be doing is trying to find a Servant, 2 Melissa Karenka, and 1 removal spell. That's your ideal level 1, so when you see your first hand, you want to mulligan anything that is not one of those cards. Ideally, you want to field 2 Melissa Karenka. Hopefully you're able to get up to the 5 Virtual Signy in Trash to activate her plus 5,000 effect and turn her into a 7,000 power wall. Having 2 7,000 power walls in the first turn is an extremely powerful stop against aggressive strategies. Likewise, at level 2, you want to have 2 10,000 power level 2s and 1 Melissa Karenka. That's 7,000 power and 2 10,000 powers, which again is extremely difficult for aggressive strategies to punch through. Along the way, you want to be using your spells and Angel level 1 to be forcing in a little bit of early damage in order to not fall too far behind. Then, once you hit level 3, you get into the real meat of the deck and you're able to start customizing your game plan depending on which cards you have access to and what the opponent's strategy is. Luthu Zahara and Reina Yorimi both provide extremely potent removal effects. Himawari Hanma provides an extremely powerful wall against aggressive strategies, as well as being able to dig deeper into your deck against controlling strategies, and Erish Kigal and Phalaris are able to give you a little bit of extra legs against more slower and controlling strategies. Generally, you're able to pull these strategies together extremely efficiently, given the amount of trash recursion in the deck between Toko level 2, Super Halesta Saber, which remains a phenomenal card, and end of the turn. Going forward, there's a few more changes that I'm looking to make, especially once the new set comes out. Dragon Maid is a card that allows you to give an opposing Signy minus 10,000 power for 1 enter whenever you refresh. And with Luluthu Zahara not penalizing you for refreshing and dumping a ton of cards from your deck into your trash, that seems like a pretty great 1-2 punch to add a little bit of extra removal power to the deck. Erish Kigal I am a little bit on the fence on. It's a card I've not particularly found is useful in many games. That being said, she has a strong life burst, and life bursts are at something of a premium here, so she'll likely stay in for the time being. I would like to perhaps cut one of the enervating melodies and possibly the last Mage You Are beta in favor of something else, but again with the extremely limited choice of life bursts to put into this deck, I'm not exactly sure what those replacements are going to be. Likewise, once the next set releases, Vertex Diva, I'm probably going to be replacing End of the Turn with White Heaven. White Heaven is very similar to Sanba Carnival in that it trashes an opposing Signy and returns another one to hand, but White Heaven costs 3 enter, while Sanba Carnival costs 5. This deck is already playing 2 White Larig, so it meets the condition already, so I think that's going to be a rather positive inclusion that'll give me a little bit more legs in the control matchup. However, while losing End of the Turn, you lose a little bit of your trash recursion, so I might throw in a random card here or there wherever I can squeeze it in. It gives me a few more options of returning cards from the trash to your hand, particularly non-virtual Signy such as Phalaris. In conclusion, if you're trying to win games of Wixoss as reliably as possible, Nijisanji is probably not the best deck for that. It is a little bit underpowered, its Larig lineup is rather restricted, it's very difficult to run this deck outside of being a dedicated Sanbaka list, and Sanbaka decks are just generally not all that powerful, particularly as other strategies are able to mix and match their game pieces as we head into a more Dream Team focused meta. That being said, I do still really enjoy Sanbaka. The deck can be very versatile and almost toolboxy with its ability to pull things out of the trash, and it has a fantastic engine of constantly generating card advantage well past the abilities of most other decks to keep up with it, particularly in Nova matchups. Nova often runs out of cards before you do. That being said, your aggressive options are not quite enough to keep pace with the more aggressive decks. Your defensive options aren't quite as good as some of the options out of the more dedicated control lists, and your ability to juggle both of them is probably not on par with a more dedicated mid-range deck that has a broader access to tools outside of Virtual Signy, like Diagram decks, which puts this deck in kind of an awkward spot of not being particularly competitive at any spot in the metagame. If you want to win, you're probably better off going the Diagram route rather than trying to force this deck to work. Again, as we head into Dream Team time, this deck is likely going to fall off even further, but I'm going to still continue trying to make it work, partially out of pure stubbornness and partially because I do genuinely really love the deck. If that appeals to you, then I wish you all the best running your Nijisanji deck. Otherwise, there's probably plenty of other decks out there that other YouTubers are definitely more qualified to talk about than me. Again, I'm definitely not the best source for this, but this is a deck that is kind of a pet deck of mine, so I do like updating it as I continue to play it. Hopefully this was at least interesting from a curiosity perspective, even if it's not particularly practical gameplay advice for the vast majority of players out there. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.